Good day, everyone. I'm Cherry Jean Requinto. I will be discussing the book Leadership and Business Ethics by Gabriel Flynn. Now, let us talk about how losing soul leads to ethical corruption in business. Let me say this first. Having a little selfishness is okay or justifiable. Because we are social animals, it's kind of in our nature by default. Little selfishness means one thinks about himself and his family's needs and security first than others. But when this selfishness crosses its limits, it turns into greed. Now, what does crossing the limits of selfishness means? I'd say you cross the limit when trying to collect wealth by illegal means or by directly or indirectly causing loss, harm to someone. To satisfy our greed, people follow the path of unfair means, betrayal, and crime. This makes others' life miserable. And even after doing so much, the greed of wealth, power, lust, belongings never ends, but brings fear of losing what you have now and turning it into insecurity in your life. How did I came up with this? Well, let's dig into it deeper. I guess we are intrigued by Bugel's title, which talk about the soul of capitalism. We want to exploit Bugel's words, if not his thoughts, and talk about corruption as the very loss of soul. But we need to get clear about what is meant by soul. To explain what soul means, we will make use of some concepts developed by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. We think his explanation would be simple. Business have lost their souls on an Aristotelian account. First is material, second is formal, third is efficient, and the fourth is final. The material cause is the staff. The formal cause is the organization of the staff. The efficient cause is the mover that brings the staff together, and the final cause is the purpose of the whole entity. In living beings, the material cause is obviously the organic body, and the formal cause is the spirit or soul. The soul, cited in Greek, is the dynamic force, or the animating animus in Latin, principle. In a discussion of the four causes, Aristotle indicates that at times the formal cause is identical with the final cause. In other words, to explain what a thing is sometimes involves explaining what it is for. In order to understand the essence or nature of something, we need to determine its purpose. For example, in order to understand what a government is, it is best to explain the purpose that a government serves, rather than providing a description of the buildings in which the government is housed. So, to understand a social institution, it is not sufficient to describe its aggregate parts, one needs to explain its purpose. With this, we can argue that a business, like a human being, is a living enterprise driven by its projects and goals. In its purposes, further, when it loses its purpose or changes its purpose, its very being is changed. Let's talk about the promise-making animal. We, humans, are created uniquely. You may ask me why? It is because we have the ability to make promises. And why is promise making mysterious and paradoxical? Well, to begin with, making and keeping a promise requires being able to transcend the present time and the here and now. So, to make a promise, you must be able to look into the future and remember the past, anticipating that at some future time you will be required to perform in a certain way, whether you want to or not, because you're promised to do so. The ability to make promises is fundamental to our existence as rational beings. If life is all about relationships, then life is all about promises. The act of promising establishes a relationship with another by committing that in the future we will act in a certain way toward another. Next is the worthwhile goals. While we talk about promises, we must remember that being a promise maker is not sufficient for being ethical. People can make false promises, vengeful promises, or promises to carry out unethical activities. People can make commitments to be unethical ends. So promises to be fully ethical must be tied to something else. They must be commitments to worthwhile goals. They must involve actions. To return to our main point, we wish to argue that the loss of soul or a purpose is a problem that has spread across the world of business. Businesses talk about vision, mission, and values. And rightly so, because those visions, missions, and values are the goals and purposes of the companies. In that sense, the goals and purposes of the corporation are the soul of the corporation. The animating and ordering principle of the organization, they give life and structure to the activities of the organization. But there can be worthwhile missions and misguided missions. Entities can be corrupted. Corporations can lose their souls. When a business strays from a worthwhile goal or purpose, it becomes corrupt. In, in other words, when companies forget that they are in business to provide goods and services for consumers and their animating purpose becomes pushing products and services to make a profit, they lose their vision and corrupt their souls. A disturbing consequence of accumulating wealth for its own sake is that the accumulator necessarily loses all sense of limits. One can never be satisfied since there is not enough wealth to satisfy. Remember this: the pursuit of wealth, on account of its limitless nature, inevitably turns every other goal or end into a money-making opportunity, and this leads to greater corruption, disharmony with one's community, and profound unhappiness. You see, because there is never enough and the end of wealth accumulation justifies any means. There is no limit on the means used to accumulate the wealth except those forced on one by the law, and this limitation is circumscribed as much as possible. What is the purpose of business? Well, the purposes or worthwhile goals provide justificatory reasons for doing something, but we are all aware of the fact that people can do things that are the right thing to do for a multiplicity of motives. For example, I can give alms to get a tax break, or to feel good, or to solve my conscience. When one looks at the discussion of the purposes of business and sees these purposes accounted for as the maximization of profit, it is clear that this discussion is referring to Smith's insistence that it is not from benevolence that the baker bakes our bread, but from his own interest. In the case of business, Adam Smith has two accounts. The first talks about motivation and claims that participants in the markets act from self-interest. But elsewhere, he talks about the overall purpose of trade and production. That is the second account. And here he clearly asserts that all this activity is for the sake of producing goods for consumers. Thus, we see that the justification of all this activity is the production of goods and services. and the motivation is self-interest. To mix motives up with these purposes is like confusing the destination of a train. This is why Smith is perfectly consistent when he says everyone is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest, his own way, and to bring both his industry and capital into competition with those of any other man or order of men as long as he does not violate the laws of justice. Thus, justice equates with the well-ordered society in the sense that each man has what he ought to have, what he deserves. And in the well-ordered society, the purpose of business is to create goods and services to benefit society. When the pursuit of our own interest begins to harm society, and when the pursuit of profit begins to harm society, this pursuit must be checked. Selfishness, which is self-interest at the expense of another, is a moral flaw, but a view that gives self-interest primacy must inevitably sacrifice justice to drives of self-interest. So as a takeaway for this lesson, to produce this public good and must dedicate himself or herself to the public good and not to any private interest. Thank you so much. Again, this has been Cherry Jean Requinto, and I hope you were able to learn more about the soul of business.